Imagine being trapped inside a metal coffin, hurtling through the sky at 300 miles per hour. Your bomber has just been torn apart by anti-aircraft fire. The nose of your aircraft is completely gone, ripped away by a direct hit, and now freezing wind at 40 degrees below zero is screaming through the cockpit. 2 of your 4 engines are on fire, trailing thick black smoke that marks your position for every enemy fighter within 50 miles. Your hydraulic system has been destroyed, which means your landing gear is stuck, your flaps won't work, and your controls are barely responding. The plexiglass windows are shattered, covered in the blood of your wounded crew members. Half the men you took off with this morning are either dead or dying, and you're still deep inside enemy territory, hundreds of miles from the safety of home, surrounded by German fighters that smell blood and are circling for the kill. Every instinct screams at you to bail out. Every training manual says to abandon the aircraft. Every logical calculation tells you this plane will never make it home. The smart thing, the safe thing, the reasonable thing would be to order your crew to jump and take your chances as a prisoner of war. But you don't give that order. Instead, you grip the control column tighter, ignore the pain from your wounds, and make a decision that defies all logic and reason. You're going to fly this broken, burning, barely functioning aircraft all the way home. You're going to bring your boys back. You're going to complete the mission. This is a story of pilots who did exactly that. Men who completed suicide missions in crippled aircraft that had no business staying in the air. Men who refused to give up when giving up was the only sensible option. Men whose courage and determination pushed the boundaries of what we thought was humanly possible. Welcome to one of the most intense episodes on this channel. Today we're going deep into the true stories of impossible missions completed against impossible odds. Stories so incredible that if Hollywood put them in a movie, audiences would walk out saying that could never happen. But these stories did happen. Every single one of them is documented, verified, and remembered by the men who lived through them. Let's begin. To understand why these stories matter, you first need to understand what aerial combat was really like during World War II. Forget everything you've seen in movies. Forget the sanitized, glamorized versions of air warfare. The reality was a nightmare beyond imagination. American bomber crews flying missions over Nazi-occupied Europe faced odds that would make a Vegas gambler weep. The 8th Air Force, the mighty force of heavy bombers that pounded Germany day after day, suffered casualties that rivaled the bloodiest infantry battles of the war. During some missions, the loss rate exceeded 30%. That means if you looked around at the 10 bombers in your formation before takeoff, 3 of them wouldn't be coming back. And the men inside those bombers, your friends, your poker buddies, the guys you ate breakfast with that morning, they would either be dead, wounded, or spend the rest of the war in a German prison camp. The average age of these bomber crews was 22. Most of them had never been outside their home state before the war. Now they were climbing into aluminum tubes filled with high explosives and aviation fuel, flying 8 hours through enemy territory, getting shot by everything the Germans could throw at them, and then trying to make a home in aircraft that were often held together by nothing more than hope and determination. The German defenses were absolutely lethal. Thousands of anti-aircraft guns, the dreaded flak batteries, ringed every important target. These guns fired explosive shells that detonated at preset altitudes, filling the sky with clouds of deadly shrapnel. A direct hit would destroy a bomber instantly. A near miss could shred engines, puncture fuel tanks, kill crew members, and turn a healthy aircraft into a flying wreck. And then there were the fighters. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, deployed hundreds of Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf fighters specifically to intercept American bomber formations. These fighters were fast, maneuverable, and armed with cannons that could tear through bomber armor like paper. They attacked in waves, from every direction, pressing their attacks with suicidal courage. German pilots would fly directly into the defensive fire of bomber formations, accepting horrific casualties in order to bring down the American planes. The bombers fought back with their own guns, of course. A-B-17 Flying Fortress carried up to 1350 caliber machine guns, and a tight formation of bombers could put up a devastating wall of defensive fire. But it was never enough. The fighters kept coming. The flak kept exploding, and the bombers kept falling from the sky. In this environment, completing a mission was an achievement. Completing a mission in a crippled aircraft was a miracle, and the men who accomplished these miracles deserve to have their stories told. Let me tell you about a young pilot named Lieutenant William Lawley and what happened to him on February 20th, 1944. Lawley was flying a B-17 bomber named Cabin in the Sky as part of a massive raid on German aircraft factories. The mission was critical. Allied commanders knew that destroying Germany's ability to produce fighters was essential to winning the air war. So they sent hundreds of bombers deep into enemy territory, knowing that many of them wouldn't come back. Cabin in the Sky made it to the target without serious damage. Lawley and his crew dropped their bombs on the factory complex and turned for home. That's when everything went wrong. German fighters swarmed the formation on the return flight, Focke-Wulf 190s. Some of the deadliest fighters in the world attacked from every direction. Cabin in the Sky was hit again and again. Cannon shells ripped through the fuselage. Machine gun bullets shattered windows and punctured fuel tanks. The number 3 engine exploded and caught fire. The number 2 engine was damaged and losing power. Then a 20-millimeter cannon shell came through the windscreen and exploded in the cockpit. The co-pilot was killed instantly. Lieutenant Lawley was hit in the face by shrapnel, temporarily blinding him. Blood poured from wounds on his head, face, and hands. The control column was slick with blood. The instrument panel was destroyed, and the aircraft, now with only 2 functioning engines and a dead man in the right seat, began to fall out of formation. Any other pilot would have given the order to bail out. Lawley couldn't see. He was bleeding badly. His co-pilot was dead. His aircraft was crippled. The logical thing, the sensible thing, was to abandon ship and let the crew take their chances with parachutes. But Lawley didn't give that order. Instead, he wiped the blood from his eyes with one hand while fighting the controls with the other. He couldn't see the instruments, so he flew by feel, by instinct, by the sound of the engines and the pressure of the wind. He ordered his crew to throw everything overboard to lighten the aircraft, guns, ammunition, equipment, anything that wasn't bolted down. He nursed the 2 remaining engines, coaxing every ounce of power from them. The German fighters, seeing the crippled bomber falling behind the formation, moved in for the kill. They made pass after pass, pouring fire into Cabin in the Sky. More crew members were wounded. The aircraft accumulated more damage. But Lawley kept flying. For hours, he fought to keep that broken bomber in the air. He flew across occupied France, across the English Channel, all the way back to England. When he finally reached friendly territory, he faced another impossible challenge: landing. The hydraulic system was destroyed, which meant the landing gear might not work. The flaps were inoperable, which meant he would have to land at a much higher speed than normal. He was still half blind from his wounds, and he had wounded men aboard who needed immediate medical attention. Lawley brought Cabin in the Sky down on the first runway he could find. The landing gear held. The aircraft touched down hard but intact. The wounded were rushed to the hospital. Against all odds, most of the crew survived. For his actions that day, William Lawley was awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States. The citation praised his extraordinary courage, his refusal to abandon his crew, and his determination to complete the mission despite wounds that would have incapacitated most men. But Lawley himself never saw it as anything special. In interviews after the war, he said he was just doing his job. He said any pilot would have done the same thing. He said the real heroes were the men who didn't come home. That humility was typical of the men who flew these missions. They didn't think of themselves as heroes. They were just doing what needed to be done. Now let me tell you about an aircraft that became a legend, a bomber so badly damaged that photographs would seem impossible, yet flew home anyway. The B-17 was nicknamed All-American, and what happened to it on February 1st, 1943, over Tunisia remains one of the most remarkable survival stories in aviation history. All-American was part of a bombing raid on German positions in North Africa. The mission went smoothly until the return flight, when German fighters intercepted the formation. In the chaos of the air battle, a Messerschmitt Bf 109 collided with All-American. The collision was catastrophic. The German fighter's wings sliced through the rear fuselage of the B-17, cutting it almost completely in half. The tail section, including the horizontal stabilizers and the tail gunner's position, was left hanging by a few stringers of aluminum and some control cables. You could literally see daylight through the gap in the fuselage. The aircraft looked like it had been cut with a giant saw. By every law of aerodynamics, All-American should have broken apart and fallen from the sky. The structural integrity was completely compromised. The control cables were exposed and damaged. The tail was literally flapping in the wind, connected to the rest of the aircraft by what amounted to a few strips of metal. But the pilot, Lieutenant Kenneth Bragg, refused to give up. With incredible skill and even more incredible calm, Bragg assessed the situation. The engines were still running. The wings were intact. The controls, though sluggish and unresponsive, still worked. The aircraft was still flying. Bragg made a decision to try to bring All-American home. The flight back to base was a masterclass in precision flying. Any sudden movement, any sharp turn, any turbulence could snap the weakened fuselage and sent the aircraft tumbling to earth. Bragg flew with surgical precision, making tiny corrections, keeping the aircraft as stable as possible, nursing it along mile by agonizing mile. The crew in the rear section, the tail gunner and the radio operator, were trapped. They couldn't move forward through the gap in the fuselage without risking the complete failure of the structure. They had to stay where they were, isolated from the rest of the crew, hoping that the aircraft would hold together long enough to get them home. Other bombers in the formation flew alongside All-American, their crews watching in amazement. They took photographs that would become some of the most famous images of the air war. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. They couldn't believe the aircraft was still in the air. After 2 hours of the most delicate flying imaginable, Bragg finally reached the base at Biskra, Algeria. Now he faced the ultimate test, landing. A normal landing puts significant stress on an aircraft structure. The impact of touchdown, the deceleration, the weight transfer, all of these forces could easily snap the weakened fuselage of All-American. Bragg knew that if he landed too hard, the tail would break off and the aircraft would cartwheel down the runway, killing everyone aboard. He made the smoothest landing of his life. All-American touched down like a feather, rolled down the runway, and came to a stop. Only then did the tail section finally give way, sagging to one side as the last structural connections failed. But by then, it didn't matter. The aircraft was on the ground. The crew was safe. All 10 men walked away from the wreck. The photograph of All-American, showing a bomber literally cut in half but still flying, became iconic images of American determination and the ruggedness of the B-17. They were used in propaganda, in training materials, in newspapers and magazines across the country. They showed the world that American aircraft and American crews could take the worst the enemy could dish out and still come home. But for the men who flew that mission, it wasn't about propaganda or symbolism. It was about survival. It was about refusing to give up. It was about bringing everyone home. The stories I've told so far focus on pilots, but the truth is that completing a suicide mission in a crippled aircraft required the efforts of the entire crew. Every man had a role to play, and often it was the actions of gunners, navigators, bombardiers, and flight engineers that made the difference between life and death. Consider the story of Staff Sergeant Archibald Matthews and the crew of the B-17 nicknamed Mi Amigo. February 22, 1944. Mi Amigo was part of a bombing raid on German aircraft factories, the same type of mission that had nearly killed Lieutenant Lawley 2 days earlier. The raid was a disaster. German fighters and flak batteries tore the American formation apart. Dozens of bombers were shot down. Hundreds of men were killed or captured. Mi Amigo was hit hard over the target. Flak shells exploded around the aircraft, peppering it with shrapnel. Fighters made repeated passes, their cannons and machine guns raking the bomber from nose to tail. The pilot was killed. The co-pilot was severely wounded. Several other crew members were injured. In the chaos, Staff Sergeant Matthews, the flight engineer, made his way to the cockpit. He found the pilot dead at the controls, and the co-pilot slumped over, barely conscious. The aircraft was in a dive, heading for ground. Matthews had never flown AB-17. He was trained as an engineer, not a pilot, but he knew the basics of flight, and he knew that if someone didn't take the controls, everyone aboard was going to die. He pulled the dead pilot from his seat, took the controls, and somehow managed to level the aircraft. Then, with the wounded co-pilot giving him instructions, he turned mi amigo toward home. For hours, Matthews flew that bomber across enemy territory. He had no formal pilot training. He was operating on instinct, on desperation, on sheer determination. The aircraft was badly damaged, losing fuel, losing altitude, barely staying in the air. But Matthews kept it flying. When they finally reached England, Matthews faced the same impossible challenge that every pilot in these stories faced, landing a crippled aircraft. But Matthews wasn't a pilot. He had never landed AB-17 in his life. He had never landed any aircraft in his life. He tried anyway. The first approach was too high. Matthews went around for another try. The second approach was better, but the aircraft was coming in too fast. The wounded co-pilot talked him through procedures, telling him when to cut the throttles, when to flare, when to touch down. Mi amigo hit the runway hard. Too hard. The weakened landing gear collapsed. The aircraft skidded across the field, shedding pieces as it went. It finally came to rest in a crumpled heap at the edge of the runway. Miraculously, most of the crew survived. Matthews, the engineer who had never flown a plane before that day, had brought them home. He was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions. The citation noted that he had displayed extraordinary heroism and selfless devotion to his crew. But like so many of these men, Matthews didn't see himself as a hero. He said he just did what anyone would have done. He said the real heroes were the men who didn't make it. Now I want to tell you about a different kind of survival story, one that shows the incredible bond between enemies in the midst of war. December 20th, 1943. A young American pilot named Charlie Brown was flying his first combat mission over Germany. His B-17, nicknamed the Old Pub, was part of a massive raid on Bremen, one of the most heavily defended targets in Europe. The mission was a catastrophe for ye Old Pub German fighters, and flak batteries hammered the bomber relentlessly. The nose section was blown open. The oxygen system failed. Multiple engines were damaged. Crew members were killed and wounded. Brown himself was hit by shrapnel and briefly lost consciousness. When he came to, the aircraft was in a steep dive, spinning toward the ground. Brown somehow managed to regain control, pulling out of the dive at treetop level. But the situation was desperate. The aircraft was destroyed. Half the crew was dead or wounded. They were deep inside Germany with no hope of fighter escort. Brown made the decision to try to fly home anyway. As the Old Pub limped across Germany, a German fighter pilot named Franz Stigler spotted the crippled bomber. Stigler was an experienced ace with dozens of kills to his credit. He moved in for an easy victory. But as he got closer, Stigler saw the extent of the damage. He saw the holes in the fuselage, the dead and wounded crew members visible through the torn metal, the blood on the windows. He saw that the bomber's guns were silent, either destroyed or unmanned. Stigler had been taught by his commanding officer that shooting a man in a parachute was murder, not war. Looking at the Old Pub, he realized that shooting this bomber would be the same thing. These men were helpless. They had no chance. Instead of firing, Stigler pulled alongside the American bomber. He tried to signal Brown to land in Germany and surrender. At least that way, the crew would survive. Brown either didn't understand or chose to ignore the signals. So Stigler made an incredible decision. He escorted the Old Pub to the North Sea, flying alongside the bomber to protect it from German anti-aircraft batteries along the coast. The German gunners wouldn't fire with one of their own fighters so close to the target. When they reached the sea, Stigler saluted Brown and turned back toward Germany. Brown managed to fly the Old Pub all the way back to England. The aircraft was so badly damaged that it never flew again, but the crew survived. Stigler never reported the incident. To do so would have meant court-martial and execution for treason. He kept the secret for the rest of the war and for decades afterward. In 1990, Nearly 50 years later, Charlie Brown finally tracked down the German pilot who had spared his life. The two men met, embraced, and became close friends. They remained friends until their deaths, which occurred within months of each other in 2008. This story reminds us that even in the midst of the most brutal warfare, humanity can survive. Stigler could have killed Brown and his crew with a single burst of cannon fire. Instead, he chose mercy. That choice created a friendship that lasted half a century and inspired millions of people around the world. The stories I've told today represent just a fraction of the incredible survival tales from World War II. Every bomber group had stories like these. Every squadron had pilots and crew members who accomplished the impossible, who brought crippled aircraft home against all odds, who refused to give up when giving up was the only sensible option. But I want to be clear about something. For every story of miraculous survival, there were dozens of stories that ended differently. For every aircraft that made it home, there were others that didn't. For every crew that survived, there were others that perished. The air war over Europe cost tens of thousands of lives. Young men, barely out of their teens, climbed into bombers knowing they might not return. Many of them didn't. They died in burning aircraft, in parachutes that didn't open, in prison camps, in hospitals. They died far from home, far from people who loved them, fighting a war they didn't start but were determined to finish. The men who survived often carried deep scars, both physical and psychological. They had nightmares for the rest of their lives. They struggled with survivor's guilt, wondering why they had lived when so many of their friends had died. They carried memories that never faded, images of burning aircraft and dying friends that haunted them until their final days. We tell these stories not to glorify war, but to honor the courage of those who fought it. We remember the pilots who completed suicide missions in crippled aircraft because their determination represents something essential about the human spirit. But we must also remember those who didn't come home, whose stories ended in fire and wreckage over foreign lands. So, what can we learn from these incredible stories? What lessons can we take from men who accomplished the impossible in machines that should never have stayed in the air? First, we learn that human beings are capable of far more than we typically imagine. When pushed to the absolute limit, when faced with impossible odds, people can find reserves of strength and determination that seem almost superhuman. The pilots and crew members in these stories weren't special in any genetic or biological sense. They were ordinary young men who discovered extraordinary capabilities within themselves when the situation demanded it. Second, we learned that preparation matters. These men had trained for emergencies until the procedures became automatic. When disaster struck, they didn't have to think about what to do. Their hands moved to the correct controls. Their minds processed information at incredible speed. Their training took over when conscious thought might have failed them. This kind of preparation is valuable in any field, not just aviation. Third, we learn that teamwork can accomplish miracles. None of these survival stories involved a single individual acting alone. They all require the coordinated efforts of entire crews. Each man doing his job, each man trusting the others to do theirs. The pilots couldn't have brought their aircraft home without the gunners, the navigators, the engineers, the radio operators. Everyone played a role. Fourth, we learned that giving up is always a choice. The men in these stories could have abandoned their aircraft. They could have bailed out and taken their chances as prisoners of war. No one would have blamed them, but they chose to keep fighting. They chose to try the impossible. And because they made that choice, they accomplished things that seem beyond human capability. And finally, we learned that mercy and humanity can survive even in the darkest circumstances. Franz Stigler's decision to spare Charlie Brown's crew reminds us that even in the midst of brutal warfare, individuals can choose compassion over killing. That choice, made in a split second over the skies of Germany, created a friendship that lasted decades and showed the world that enemies can become brothers. We've covered a lot of ground today. We've talked about pilots who flew with shrapnel in their eyes, about bombers that were literally cut in half but kept flying, about engineers who landed aircraft they had never been trained to fly, about enemies who became friends. But all these stories share a common thread. They're all about people who refused to accept defeat, people who looked at impossible situations and said, "I'm going to try anyway," People who push themselves and their machines beyond every conceivable limit because giving up simply wasn't in their nature. These men didn't know they would survive. They didn't know their stories would be told 80 years later. They simply did what they believed was right, what their training had prepared them for, what their sense of duty demanded. And in doing so, they showed us what human beings are capable of at their very best. The next time you face a challenge that seems impossible, remember these stories. Remember the pilots who kept flying after their aircraft were shot to pieces. Remember the crews who worked together to accomplish miracles. Remember that giving up is always a choice, and that choosing to keep fighting can lead to outcomes that seem beyond possibility. These men completed suicide missions in Crippled, barely flying aircraft. They did it through skill, through determination, through teamwork, and through an absolute refusal to quit. Their stories deserve to be remembered. Their courage deserves to be honored, and their example deserves to inspire us all. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. These stories took extensive research to compile, and I hope they've been as meaningful to you as they have been to me. If you want to hear more stories like these, let me know in the comments. There are countless tales of aerial heroism that deserve to be told, from every era of aviation history. I could do entire episodes on individual missions, individual aircraft, individual crews. And if you know someone who served in the military, especially someone who flew in combat, take a moment to thank them, whether they saw action or not. They volunteered to put themselves in harm's way for something larger than themselves. That deserves recognition and respect. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss future episodes. Your support helps bring these stories to a wider audience and ensures that the courage of these men is never forgotten. Until next time, keep looking up. The sky has witnessed incredible acts of courage, and the men and women who fly through it deserve our respect and remembrance. See you in the next episode.